Hello, my name is Rui Ma, and I am a China tech analyst and investor based in San Francisco, California. I was born in China and grew up here in the Bay Area. I went to college at UC Berkeley, majoring in EECS, and after I graduated about 17, 18 years ago, I worked in investment banking here in the Bay Area, focusing on technology companies. And then in 2007, I moved to China for personal reasons and stayed there for the next 8 years. I also stayed in finance and worked in covering a wide variety of industries, but mostly focused on technology. So I was very lucky to be there when a lot of Chinese tech startups that you would have heard of today was just starting to get founded and funded. When I was in China, one of the most interesting jobs I had was working for 500 Startups, which is a global investment fund and accelerator program. I covered the Greater China region, and I was also very lucky to visit Korea quite a few times and meet many entrepreneurs and investors there. In 2016, I returned to Silicon Valley, and a couple years ago, I started a company called TechBuzzChina, which focuses on disseminating interesting insights and knowledge from the Chinese tech industry to the English-speaking world. I think the way China tech developed can be roughly broken up into 3 stages. So the first stage I would call copy to China, and that's really from the late 1990s to 2010 or so. And it was really a lot of entrepreneurs, many of them who went overseas and were educated in the United States or elsewhere in the world, going back to China and taking interesting business models and opportunities they learned and replicating them for the domestic market. From 2010 to 2015, I would really call it the rise of the mobile internet. This is really when, the smartphone was released and invented, and China quickly became the largest market. And today, as we can see, mobile internet dominates China. The smartphone really allowed Chinese entrepreneurs to focus on the domestic market, but create really interesting and different opportunities that are mobile first. From 2015 to now, I would say it's different. The ecosystem has become a lot more diverse. So consumer internet is no longer the main way that, unicorns appear in China. So there are a lot more subsectors that are being worked on, anywhere from hardware, robotics, healthcare, enterprise software, all these things that China wasn't strong in and is now starting to develop domestically. Before 2015, I would say whenever the words China tech were mentioned, a lot of times is really referring to consumer internet. From now on, I think it will be different. So we could use the words deep tech, although I think it's a little confusing because it's not very well defined. But basically anything outside of consumer internet, I would say. The top 3 categories that have consistently been the most funded industries in the past 5 years are enterprise software, advanced manufacturing, and healthcare. So those are the sectors where something like almost half of the early stage venture capital is being poured into. Enterprise software is something maybe easier for many viewers to understand. This is a place where China has seen relatively little success, right? So in the US, in comparison, the bulk of companies that are founded and funded in the software industry serve businesses. In China, that has not been the case until recently. And actually, it still remains to be seen whether or not we'll see a great many successes from this sector, but there are certainly a lot more unicorns than before. So definitely macroeconomic conditions are a lot poorer than they were a couple years ago. Venture capital funding has, as a result, suffered. What I see, I think that is most credible is that there is sort of a difference in the amount of decline you see in US dollar denominated funds, which is a very large amount. So something like I've seen 50% declines, and versus RMB denominated venture capital funds, which have seen either, depending on the data set, a far less steep decline, or in some cases I've actually seen it increase year on year. We will see what happens next year or over the next several years. But the decline is not as precipitous as I think some of the data sets I see in English-speaking media, and I think that's mainly because they don't take into account the RMB fundings. So there has been a commensurate rise in RMB fundings over the last couple of years as more and more local capital flood into the system. But it's still not enough, right, to defray the decline in US dollar fundraising. It's heavily dependent on the sector you're in. Some of the very heavily funded sectors in the last couple of years, like EdTech, have been hurt because of policy reasons in China. There are other sectors like gaming that have also seen declines because of regulatory pressure. And as I said earlier, consumer internet companies in general, because of saturation, because of the large platforms, sucking all the oxygen out of the ecosystem, it's hard to find opportunities. But if you were in places like semiconductors, it's so hot in China right now, the semiconductor space. In fact, I think the joke is that 5 years ago, you could seat all the semiconductor investors in China at the same dinner table. But nowadays, there are thousands of them trying to find companies to invest in. So it kind of depends. You could even argue that a space like semiconductors is overheated in China. Exactly, it's tough. So I would say for semiconductor companies, it depends where you are in the value chain, right? So some companies need a lot more CapEx than others. Venture capitalists actually tend to invest in the lighter CapEx businesses anyway. A lot of government funding is directed to sort of the more CapEx intensive companies. But just like in any other industry, the rate of success is very low, right? It's difficult to create an industry leader, much less a global leader. So therefore, that's why I was saying earlier, some people think the semiconductor startup space in China is overheated right now. Just to give you an idea of how overheated it is, I think in Q1, I was reading a report on, the top 100 semiconductor startup fundraisings globally, and something like over 60 of them were to Chinese startups. So yeah, that's how crazy it is. The main thing you have to really ask yourself is, what are you bringing that is special and differentiated from a local player? Because the cost of labor in China is quite low, and the development talent is actually pretty decently sophisticated. So if you have a business that is, really easy to copy, or it just isn't that complicated or special, you're going to face a lot of local competition. An example I like to use when I talk about foreign companies entering China is LinkedIn. Now, I know they actually officially pulled out of China for privacy law reasons, but before they did, their core product was actually growing pretty healthily in China, despite them putting not very much effort into promoting it. And the reason why is because if you think about it, a professional network, while not that hard to build, LinkedIn had something very different. It had access to the rest of the world. So if you were a Chinese citizen and you wanted to access recruitment, job opportunities, and professional networking opportunities, LinkedIn was your only choice if you wanted to interact with international professionals. In China, the government does play a very large role, but I think what it does in the tech space, it really depends on which subsector you're talking about. So the government is highly focused actually on more R&D focused sectors. So right now, for example, it's putting in a lot of money into climate, into semiconductors, into electric vehicles, things like that, infrastructure related projects. For the internet space, the government did help a lot as well, but really more in helping to shape, I think, people's attitudes. So back in 2014 and 15, it was not as fashionable for people to go work at a startup because these were considered, high risk, but also not very high status positions in society. The government put a very large sort of PR campaign throughout the country and really encouraged young people to go and work for these companies and even do their own startups. Now, a lot of them failed, but I think the end result was that people's attitudes towards working in startups were changed, and it became a lot more cool and acceptable, even enviable, to go and be an entrepreneur. I think that's very similar to Korea, right? If you look at most of the companies that were very successful, very few of them were as a result or as a direct result of government programs. Most of them were just good companies and good founders. And they probably, I would actually say most of the really large internet companies in China, it's just a result of really good entrepreneurs, followed by good private capital. I think in China, those government programs made entrepreneurship much more accessible to the general public. But most of the startups that really succeeded because of really free market. However, when they grew bigger, sometimes the government would help them grow even bigger. I don't know what is the exact situation in Korea, but globally, a lot of economies are pretty bleak. However, I would say if you're a startup entrepreneur, don't be too pessimistic, because this could be a really great time to start a business. Historical data, I think, shows that many of the most innovative and successful companies in the past have been born out of economic crises. So good luck.